Good morning, everyone. Welcome all of you joining the public presentation organized by the Occupational Health Center. Today's topic is about the integrating psychological health and safety with hybrid workplaces. So we're so pleased to have our occupational health nurse from the Occupational Health Center, Geoffrey Thompson, is going to present for us. So we are going to begin by acknowledge that we are on the Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Greek, OG Greek, Dakotas, and Diné peoples, and the homelands of Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that we were made on these territories, and we acknowledge that we are all treaty people. At the Occupational Health Center, we commit ourselves to a process of reconciliation with Indigenous communities. For someone who doesn't know about Occupational Health Center, we are funded by the Winnipeg Regional Health Authorities, and we are the community health center located on 167 Sherbrooke Street, Winnipeg, Manitoba here. So we provide the services to the Manitoba workers with work-related health issues and work closely with the job workplace health and safety committees for training. So please visit our website for more information, and all our service is free. I know that, Geoffrey have lots of information he's going to pass this out. So please help me to welcome Geoffrey.
Thanks, Tiffany. So this is a webinar. I'm going to talk for about 45 or 50 minutes, and then you can go ahead and use the chat if you want to post some questions, but I'm going to save that toward the end. I'm sure this might bring up a lot of questions for folks, so that's perfectly normal. So today's presentation, integrating psychological health and safety with hybrid workspaces. So for those of you who've heard me speak before, workplace psychological health and safety tends to be my bailiwick, my area of work for the last 6 or 7 years. And so what we have now, of course, is a new world, new environment, new reality with COVID, right? Coming out of this pandemic. And I want to start with some really clear definitions. So we need to sort that out. But before we do that, I want to try a poll. So let me go ahead and throw our first polling question out here. Give me one moment. Tiffany, is that showing up? Yes, there we go. All right. So I'm going to read it out loud so folks who are listening to the recording, these don't show up on the recording. So please rate how important hybrid work is to your current work management system. So the choices are very important, important, somewhat important, or not very important. I suspect most of you are going to be somewhere in the top 3 choices there, although we might have some curious folks who don't have any hybrid stuff happening and they're just curious, so that's all right. And when we get to 80%, I'm going to cut it off. We're at 84%, 90%. This looks good. And right now, as I suspected, we've got 71% of you at very important, another 18% important, and then 10% not as important. So you're in the right place. So odds are you're probably already doing this, right? And we're going to talk more around how to make it more psychologically safe and healthy for folks. So when we talk about psychological health and safety, that's my first slide here. We are talking about a primary prevention approach to controlling what we call psychosocial hazards. So if this is a new idea to you, we do promote the CSA standard here for workplace psychological health and safety. It's a voluntary standard, meaning it's not enforced by legislation, but it is encouraged for employers because this is a really good benchmark for being a progressive employer of choice, quite frankly, meaning that you care about the mental health and well-being of your workforce, and you're putting parameters in place to assess and identify certain factors that turn into hazards. And we'll go over a few of those quickly. But you recognize that this is a shared responsibility, that everyone in the workplace has a role to play, but really it's employers who have this obligation to act. So because it's voluntary, we can't force this on folks, right? But we're hoping that enough workplaces notice that there are real tangible benefits to taking a closer look at psychological health in this manner. And it is about a system. So the CSA standard is great. It's a little technical. So if you're coming from a smaller workplace, it might be a lot to read in one setting. This is partly what my role is. So if later you have questions and want to follow up with me about what this really is all about, I'll be sure to put my email address in the chat. But something that the CSA standard doesn't talk a lot about, and I wish they did, was really about the use of power. And I don't mean this in a mean way. I just mean that it's a fact of life, right? We live, we're all social creatures. We all are used to hierarchy. We're used to people who are in charge. We have bosses, we have managers. So it's not something scary. It's just a reality. Power is hopefully being used in an appropriate manner, in a trust and fair way in your workplace. But understanding where the roots of that power lie and what you do about that, with that authority, is really important. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And finally, the other piece is diversity. And so understanding that your workplace is diverse, you think about human rights, you think about all of these types of identities and overlapping individual characteristics that are protected by human rights law, but also just it's really good business practice, really, to think, oh, I have a diverse workforce with lots of points of view, lots of great information, perspectives that if I were smart, I would want to tap into and really understand. So I want to highlight these two elements as we go through, especially when we're talking about hybrid, because you're going to find that those power dynamics are going to shift. You're going to see different things kind of bubble up in terms of relationships and how people get along or don't get along, or where there might be some assumptions or some misunderstandings. And so getting as much good information from your folks is really important. So some of the selected workplace factors that I'm just going to go over very briefly, there are actually 13 that have been researched that are known to either help or hinder a psychologically healthy or safe work environment. So I think of them as like levers or like gears in a car, if you ever drove a manual stick. And if a workplace is doing well, if a workplace identifies these as either weak areas or strong areas and does their part to bolster them, then you're going to see better outcomes. Okay, so psychological support has to do with whether folks really are trained or the culture permits folks to notice, to see whether, someone's just a little off, maybe a little disheveled, maybe not quite themselves, maybe their productivity is off. But rather than coming out with a big stick and, tapping their wrists, you actually ask, appropriately curious questions. What's going on? Is everything all right? And from that, you get a real shift in culture, and you help direct people to the resources and supports that they need, right? Balance. So we're going to talk about hybrid and remote work and what that means for work-life balance. So that is a critical component. We'll definitely talk more about that. But does your employer recognize that you show up with, a whole host of other obligations and needs, things that you need to take care of on your day-to-day basis, besides just being owned for that 7 or 8 hours that you're at your desk? Okay. So clear leadership and expectations has to do with that communication framework, clarifying what those expectations are, and that's going to change potentially in a hybrid work environment. And so being really upfront about that is crucial, because when you don't have clear leadership and expectations, that creates a sense of anxiety and frustration, and folks just make assumptions, right? Especially when there's nothing happening, there's no real clarity, then people tend to paint kind of a worst case scenario. That's a very natural human thing to do. So on the heels of that, if you are making decisions around communication, management, productivity expectations, having your workforce actually involved in that just might seem pretty obvious, but you'd be surprised how many jobs are out there where you have your job description, you have your in and your out, and that's all you do. And no one really questions kind of ways you could tweak a job description or look at some other ways of engaging that person, leveraging their strengths that they bring to the table, rather than just assuming you're here to be X or Y. Now, psychological protection is similar in terms of psychological safety, this idea that you show up at work and just like you have a right to a harassment-free workplace, you have a right to a psychologically safe work environment. So that is challenging because, like I said, the CSA standard is voluntary. There's a lot of this stuff that isn't enforceable unless you've experienced things like vicarious trauma or post-traumatic stress. It's really hard to get some of this stuff compensable through workers' comp, for example. But psychological protection is really just thinking about this in terms of protective measures, guardrails, and I'll be talking a whole lot more about that in a minute. So we are in the year 2022, and at the beginning of the pandemic, so many of us were just thrown out there, thrown into the wolves when it came to remote work. We've had some time since then, so I'm really hoping folks have had a chance to let the dust settle and have looked at their policies and procedures and have actually put into practice some better ways to think about remote work. So I chose a pyramid for this because I feel like remote work is kind of like the ultimate thing we are talking about is remote work, but that hybrid work is that bridge between in-office and, of course, working from home, the WFH. And I put as that foundation flexibility, which I'm going to talk to more in a minute. So when we define remote work, we are talking about flexible work arrangements that allow employees to work from a remote location or their office. And the arrangement is meant in part to ensure some better work-life balance. And it's a bit of a you scratch my back, I scratch yours, because companies can save money. It can provide other opportunities for careers and enumeration benefits. You can actually hire folks from out of province, for example, to come provide the work and support you need to do your business here in Manitoba. So it's a wonderful opportunity from a hiring standpoint, and there's a lot of benefits. We'll talk more about the pros and cons in a minute. Now, hybrid, of course, is once again this idea of a blend, right? Seems obvious. And when I did some research for this presentation, I found that there's a whole lot of, different semantic ways of framing this. I think it's easier to think of it. It's easy to think of it as remote work and in office. But the fact is that remote work piece can be, it's not just a single idea, right? Because that remote work could be at home. It could be, quite frankly, in a coffee shop. It could be in the library. It could be anywhere that's not on site. And so I think this idea of work from home is, I don't want to say it's dated. I just think that there's other ways to think about it rather than just I'm at home in my pajamas. So when I did other looking at this, there's a whole lot of marketing surveys out there on what folks are thinking about remote work and hybrid work. A lot of this, of course, is coming from the US. So one survey said that 83% of workers reported that they'd prefer a hybrid work model where they can work at least 25% of the time as they need to offsite. And 47% of employees stated that they would leave their job for another company if they had a hybrid work model in place. So there's kind of, there's this gray literature out there, business versus kind of what the marketing pros are trying to tell us. But it's a thing, right? It's whether it's an expectation or whether it's certainly not necessarily a right, but what's happening depending on your sector is that, competitive employers, especially in this tighter labor market, are finding that they need to offer this. They need to offer this as an option, and they need to be really upfront about what this looks like. So the other couple pieces I want to mention about remote work is we forget that, yes, we're actually still in the pandemic, and it is one of the best ways to prevent not just COVID in the workplace, but really any disease or virus, for example. So colds and flus, right? We're going into flu season here real soon if we're not in it already. And so one thing that's happened with remote work is it's allowed people to stop and think, oh, if I'm not feeling well, I'm going to stay home today. I'm going to work from home. And so having that option, I think, is certainly from a health and safety standpoint, really great. So let's see here. I should note that not every job is suited for remote work. And so I think this is where a hybrid framework can get a little dicey, where you've got some more knowledge-based work that can be done remotely or more office-based. It is a little easier to sell or to promote, but other folks, their job may not allow that. And so having some really frank conversation about that and reframing that in your workplace is really, really important. And at the end of the day, let's not forget that remote work is still a privilege. It's quite frankly a white collar sort of thing. And those folks who are working in the front lines doing face-to-face work, that's never going to change. So far as I can tell, there'll always be jobs of that nature. And so I like to think of hybrid beyond just it being about remote work, but actually thinking a little more holistically about a job and about the work. So being a little more mindful of what a person can bring as a hybrid of themselves, as well as what the job demands. So I'm not going to talk too much about that, except that I think it's an opportunity with this whole discussion around remote work to think also about how we engage our frontline folks and how we give them a little more autonomy and a little more control over what they do. Now, I know that's easier said than done because there's a lot of external factors that force the hands of employers and managers, and I'm not here to say that's easy, but I think it's something we can strive for. Now, pros and cons of hybrid work. I'm going to go through this quickly. Now, I chose, for those of you who grew up in the 80s and 90s like I did, an Atari controller, which was the first like, oh yay, I get to like move something around on a screen. And it was exciting. It is exciting. I like video games, sure. It provided some autonomy and some control. And so when you think about what happened at the start of the pandemic, depending on what side of this fence you landed on, it was either really, really great opportunity, or it was, oh my gosh, this has turned my life upside down. And so I'm hoping that some of this has kind of been washed out in terms of a workplace working through some of the life circumstances of their workers. But at the end of the day, what's happening quite quickly is where you might have an Atari controller on the left, you've got like some super advanced PlayStation controller that's falling apart on the right-hand side. And so I think what the fear of many managers, I feel, it can be like, what do we do now? What do we do to hold this together, right? I mean, there was this thrust into remote work. Now we want to claw back some of it, but we want to do it in ways that are going to be constructive and not destructive. But I think at the end of the day, really, remember I talked about power at the beginning, and this is really striking at the heart of the employer-employee relationship, which is who has the power, who decides when and where you work, and to a large degree, how. But really, a lot of the benefits that come with hybrid and remote work is this chance to be your own person in more ways than you were before. So that autonomy, that control, that being able to have a preference and to be able to optimize your work environment and your productivity in ways that can ebb and flow based on your work and your life is a huge benefit. And it's a huge mental health benefit. It's been shown to increase job satisfaction, motivation, engagement, creativity, and it can actually strengthen teams if done in a good way in terms of remote platforms. And what it also does is it provides more equitable access for folks who might be less visible in the workplace, right? These might be neurodiverse individuals, those with some other special needs, or people who live and work in geographically dispersed communities. They can now apply to some of these jobs if there's remote work options. So there's all sorts of things. Less turnover. I'm not going to rattle on any more stats here. You can imagine there's certain cost benefits as well as environmental benefits to not commuting as much. So there's really a lot going for it. Now, but the challenges can be really a barrier depending on what your culture is used to and what, quite frankly, your leadership is willing to do in terms of experimenting with some of these ideas. So the risk is that people feel isolated, and we knew this was happening during the pandemic. We knew people felt, out there on a limb. And I know for myself, our clinic here, we were, forced into remote like everyone else, but would come in when we could. And now it feels great. I missed the in-person interaction. So there's a real value for in-person. But how do you actually make it work when you've got folks who for whatever reason they can't come in, or they've got the flexibility to stay at home? And depending on the composition of your workforce, like I said, if you've got a lot of different job descriptions, and some people are working with clients on the front end and others are working in the back end, and the people in the back end can work from home more often than those in the front, you could create a sense of negativity and resentment, and it can color perceptions and make folks feel left out, or they might make unfair assumptions that, oh, those remote workers have it easy. And in some ways they do, but in other ways they're actually at higher risk for burnout. That's what a lot of the research is saying now, because you don't always know when to turn it off, right? Because you're at home and you have to set some of your own boundaries. So other challenges is that it can actually harm people's career development depending on the sector. Okay, so if you're in marketing, for example, and you're used to having like a creative team around you, but for whatever reason, you're new, especially for young folks, this can be a real challenge. You haven't had a chance to network and get to meet people. Conferences are starting up again, but it's a real risk if you're especially hired as a remote worker, and then you never get a chance to actually get in and meet folks. So the issue too is around meetings, right? When do you have in-person? When do you have virtual? So where many folks, like 72% of folks from this one survey on Google, said that they thought that virtual meetings improve inclusion and participation, but then almost the same amount of people said that they've had too many of them, right? And so now we've created inadvertently this kind of mass culture of Zoom meetings to Zoom meetings with literally no time for bathroom breaks or anything. And so this idea of tech overload, tech failure, is a real challenge for folks who are remote or in person, but particularly remote. So at the end of the day, it's finding ways to reframe and reconstruct what your workplace might look like. And I'm not here to say I have all the answers. My job is to just kind of hopefully provide you with some good information and some insights, some inspiration. But let's talk quickly about types of work models. And I have a polling question on this, but I'm going to first throw this out there. There's really 4 that I found that are kind of the go-to. One is the flexible option, which is everyone just gets to choose when and where they work and how they work on their own, and they get to keep an office kind of when they need it. So that's assuming, quite frankly, a pretty well-resourced workplace that would allow people to work from home whenever they wanted and come in when they wanted. And so that's actually the Occupational Health Center. We were that way for a number of months, a better part of a year. And we've since switched to what we would call a fixed hybrid model, which is the employer with hopefully some discussion with the workforce deciding, okay, we need you to come in on certain days. And that does limit personal control, but it does create, I think for us, I won't speak for everyone else, but for me, it's created a new sense of solidarity around, okay, we're a clinic. We have patients, we have people who come to us. We need, at least a minimum number of people here at all times to provide those kinds of services. So, and it's allowed for more of this, hallway chit chat and things that you missed. I was just chatting with a coworker last week about how, I needed to talk to her about something, and I wanted to, like we could try Slack because we have Slack, or we could try Zoom. But sometimes it's exhausting to think, oh, why do we need to set up a Zoom for that? Like, can't we just, poke our heads in and in 5 or 10 minutes work through what it is we need? And sure enough, we happen to both be in on the same day, and it worked out. So that's the benefit of a fixed schedule, because it allows, some certainty for both parties, whether that's the employer or the employee. So you can see I have those kind of across from each other. The other 2 is remote first or office first. And what that means is identifying whether your go-to is to be more remote or to be more office. And the idea, it has also to do with how you use your space. If you're a remote first, then the office space is kind of not the afterthought, but it's the secondary priority. Whereas, most people are going to be working offsite, and they can come in when they need to, and you might have hot desking or some other approach where people are sharing space. The office first is also this idea that, it's similar to fixed, but it creates more opportunity for collaboration. So it might be a little bit more structured, just all things depending. So anyway, it's once again, it comes down to that control piece. And so thinking about where you're at with your workforce or your workplace, I'd be really curious to know what you guys do. So let's just do this really quick. Polling question number 2, hybrid models. Where does your workplace fall on the spectrum of hybrid work models? So the choices are remote first, meaning remote work is the default. Flexible, people can come and go as they please. Office first, in office is the default and individuals can choose their day. Yeah, that was the big difference. Whereas fixed it's basically like office first, but the employer fixes or has a little more authority over the day. So, good. All right, I've got about 75% of you coming in. All right, so we've got quite a blend here, huge blend actually. Fewer of you are all remote, which is understandable because that's a really big jump. And then we've got a lot of folks are flexible and office first, fixed. Okay, and nobody said anything else. So I think the take-home message here is you find what works for you. And how you find what works for you is rather than forcing it from the top down is to actually, of course, have these discussions, what's going to work. Which leads me to my next slide, which is this idea of true, like foundational flexibility. And how does your workplace define flexibility? Okay, and so that means having honest conversations about how much people are working and how they think they can work better. And so this is really it can be a mind shift for folks. It depends on how you view management. Do you view management as a means unto itself, or is it a way to optimize the work, the mission, whatever it is your organization is trying to accomplish? And I think what can happen, especially in large organizations, is the managers, in all well-intended, they don't mean it necessarily, but it's a bureaucracy and it kind of feeds on itself and it becomes this thing that exists for itself. Whereas flexibility, true flexibility, is recognizing that, yeah, it's the frontline folks, it's the staff, it's the people providing these services or products, whatever that might be, that need this flexibility. So having that frank conversation is really important, and understanding whether, is this threatening? Is this idea threatening to you? If it is, then I would maybe step back and think really hard about what you want to do with hybrid, because you're going to run up against some walls if you're not willing to have this conversation. Now, I want to just quickly say, and I mentioned this in passing earlier, we are in what many folks want to call a post-pandemic situation. I'm a bit nervous by the news when you hear about some of these other variants and how the vaccines aren't quite as effective as they used to be, even with the bivalent options out there now. So what we're finding now, and my partner works for the U of M, and he's expressed it as well. Like people are just, they're sick. They're sick with anything, and they're just not as available. Things are slower, takes longer to get stuff done. So I think that's kind of what we're in, is this quagmire of people just are either going to stay home and work or not work, but either way, it's kind of gumming up the works. So I don't like to think that we're out of the pandemic just yet, not to be a Debbie Downer on that front. Now, this is a slide I've used before, but apart from just the idea of hybrid is this idea that there might be things happening under the surface that were always there or happening before, okay? And so what can happen is if folks were remote, if they were hybrid, it was an opportunity for them to kind of, for some, take a breather and be like, ooh, I'm not around this person anymore. I don't have to, constantly walk on eggshells or do certain things to protect myself because I'm at home. I've got a little more control over my life. And so you might be finding that as people get back together, some of these old patterns and habits start coming up, which once again brings me back to the whole psych health and safety model, which is, hybrid flexibility. These things aren't going to fix fundamental issues if you've got other stuff happening under the surface. For me, it's when the good people quit, when people who know their value and they know, they're worth their salt, but not here, but maybe somewhere else. This is a tight labor market. People are finding other options elsewhere if this isn't working for them. So just, I don't mean that I just mean that as a matter of fact, right? And so they probably have really good reasons for what's going on there. Which, once again, this is one of my other slides I've used before, but thinking about what might be going on under the surface when it comes to mental health or potential mental illness. Now, I'm an optimist. I feel people have integrity. I feel when I come to work on a daily basis, or if I work from home, wherever, I want to put on my A game. I want to not just do it to make myself look good, but I do it because I care about the work. I care about the mission. I want to contribute. I have dignity and purpose. So that's kind of maybe an ideal, that's that optimist in me. And not everyone has that in their job. And I understand that. But legally, we are required in the employer-employee contract to disclose if there is something going on that is deeply affecting my ability to work. Now, if it's a physical issue, an injury, or an illness like cancer or some other obvious thing that a mental illness can cover over, then it can be easier to perhaps disclose, because people might be like, oh, hey, like, how can we help? How can we support? The problem with mental illness is it's so easily buried, and folks that self-stigma is this fear that I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy enough to raise my hand and be counted, to be noticed, for fear of what happened to other people when they stuck their neck out, or that I'm just, maybe they're blowing it off too. Maybe it's signs of burnout, but you're not diagnosed with anything. But if someone does have a reckoning with themselves, and they realize, I'm just not myself, and I do need to say something, I do think most people want to disclose. They want to say something to their manager or their employer. So that's where this statistic came from, at any rate. And I think this might have been one of the CMHA stats from a little while ago. The challenge, though, is only about 30% of people felt safe in doing so. And so that creates a really rough catch-22 for workers, because on the one hand, you might be like, oh, there's something going on. I'm not myself today. There's some issues with either the job or with what's happening, but I don't feel safe saying anything. And so that's when I say, okay, this is it's a different kettle of fish, in the sense that these are issues that need to be worked out kind of at that HR employer accommodation level, assuming you have some trust and psychological safety. It gets complicated in a hybrid work environment, because how are you communicating to people, and can you see them, right? The videos aren't enough to even catch tone of voice, even sometimes, or body language. It's better. It's better than just audio. But when you don't really see someone when you're in person, it can be really challenging. So I think the other piece to this is going back to the books and thinking about how we notice, how we act on that psychological part, that psychological support that I mentioned earlier. Which does lead me back to this idea that psychological safety is the keystone concern, that ability, right? It's this belief that I feel safe enough, that the interpersonal risk isn't so high that I can stand up and speak up, share relevant ideas. I have questions, I have concerns. And so it happens when you feel respected and trusted, even candid, obligated to be candid. And once again, if your workplace has got some other challenges with that trust factor, then this is going to be even harder. And hybrid it amplifies that, makes it either better or worse, depending on where you were when this all started. So once again, I already talked about some of the advantages to hybrid work, but I would go even further to say that beyond that, it is about perspective taking. It's, if you trust your worker to be offsite and doing their job, and you check in with them every so often, like, you're trusting that they're going to do their job, right? And so having those check-ins, checking on how they're doing, being curious, showing that you care about their perspective, all of that is hugely, immensely important to have in any workplace, period, whether it's all in person or not, but particularly in hybrid. So once again, that's key. I want to throw out here this other idea. I don't know if you are on any of these blogs or read any of the news about, job hacks and things you can do to kind of get by and improve what would otherwise be a really challenging, difficult situation. So you might be feeling that hybrid right now or remote work right now is its own form of hacking, doing what you have to do given the situation. It's not always ideal. Some workplaces, some managers actually promote the idea that, yeah, you do what you got to do. This is a form of resiliency. Get in there, find those workarounds, find those hacks, and then share them. And I'm not opposed to some of that, right? It's just if you're doing it to the detriment of someone else. For example, if your hack is to borrow some material from someone else, a coworker perhaps, that's not going to stand. Right. And so the problem with hacks and workarounds, and they can be symptoms. The symptomology here is if you see a bunch of this happening, that means you've got some real challenges with certainly team solidarity, but also understanding, really it's a quality question. Like, are we all on the same page when it comes to what our shared goals and expectations are? And so if it's a resourcing problem and you're having to use like personal, material or tools or equipment, that's a form of hacking, but once again, that's not ideal, right? And from a privacy standpoint, that's even worse. So it's partly resourcing, it's partly framing, it's partly, the job crafting piece. I like to use that term as well. It's a little more positive. It's, am I allowed enough freedom to take a fixed job and put some of my own personal energy into that, right? And that's great. So an example of that would be, if like for myself, I'm a bit into informatics and I like measuring things. And so at my office, I've helped develop some, ways to track things. So I'm a nurse. I'm not necessarily paid to do that necessarily, although that's within my scope of practice. It's something I enjoy. And so if you can find these things that are enjoyable and allow people a little bit of give and take on that, you would be surprised what that does to certainly motivate and prevent a sense of better engagement. And we know that this is an issue in the workplace. According to the Harvard Business Review, 9 out of 10 employees would take a position that paid less if they felt more motivated. All right, so this poster's meant to be very sarcastic. And it's funny in the sense, but also, gallows humor. What do you do? What do you do when you have these unhappy people who just can't pull their weight? So once again, how are you framing your workforce? If they're all just unhappy people, if they're all just cogs in a machine, if you dehumanize them in that manner, then you're going to have a hard time pulling them back and saying, hey, did you remember? Did you forget? We actually have a shared sense of purpose here. So there's Gallup studies to show that, more than a quarter, up to 36% of Americans feel engaged. So that's 36% out of 100% feel engaged. So that means 3/4 don't. So you've heard this term quiet quitting, right? This idea that I'm going to just do what I barely have to do. And so what happens with, remote is that people can sometimes get away with this. They can sometimes get away with being, present, but not present, toggling their Slack updates or their MS Teams, they can do things to make it look like they're working, but they really aren't. So that demotivation piece is certainly an ongoing concern. And I think workers and especially employers need to think about hybrid as this opportunity rather than allowing some of these workarounds and hacks and things to persist, to actually pull people back in and say, hey, this isn't working. What's going to work better? And then allowing folks to have some of that freedom. Once again, you might have a wellness program. You might actually have really great benefits for folks. But I'm not here to sell you on this idea that if you've got a wellness program and you've got folks who may or may not be accessing it for whatever reason, I'm not here to say that that's your answer either. And I don't love some of these ideas which are built around, if you're feeling bad, if you're feeling concerned about your workload, then, go get some counseling, go take a course on resiliency. Even mindfulness sometimes has been co-opted to be this way of just getting through, right? Getting through the suffering is somehow a gift, and make the most of it. And so I don't buy that. I don't buy that. So HR departments that use these as ways to try and get people, up and running. I'm certainly not opposed to wellness by any stretch. But I want to read this to you. So this is a quote from a book I read. Some of these programs, they're there to help individuals enhance performance and autonomy in competitive workplaces, allow them to cope with organizational changes and multitasking demands, increases their flexible behavior, manage emotional expressions, pursue newer and more challenging goals, recognize promising opportunities, build rich and extensive social networks, or rationalize failures in a positive or productive way. That's like, whoa, that's like, shoving a funnel in someone's mouth and saying, drink, right? And so I think whether it's overt or covert, sometimes we think that, if we provide training, if we provide wellness opportunities for people, that they'll amp up their self-care and they'll get by. Now, the challenge with that is if you really do believe in kind of this primary prevention idea around psych health and safety is you need more than that. You don't need boundaries as much. People need to set their own boundaries. They need to know when to say no, when to say yes, but it's really more about the guardrails. It's about setting really team-based expectations around what that looks like. And so an example for that would certainly be how in a hybrid setting, you're going to communicate. Right. And so I'm going to talk a little bit later about policy, but hopefully you have parameters in place that really outline those expectations, how frequently you check in, what's the mode of doing that, rather than, expecting everyone to just turn on a dime, respond to every email within 24 hours even or less, and then expect people to set those so-called boundaries. And it's helpful when managers lead the way and don't reply to their auto reply that says they're on vacation. Please don't reply. If you're on vacation, we want to believe you, right? And don't expect that, because you're actually modeling behavior that others are going to just feel like, okay, well, if the boss isn't really on vacation, then maybe I won't either. Or I'm worried that if I'm not responding, then I'm going to be looked down upon. So it's really this idea, it's taking more ownership as a group versus putting this all on the individual. So finally, the last piece here I want to talk about, and I realize I am running out of time. It always happens with me. I need to speak about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So being inclusive means, and I've talked about this already, right? It's that involvement and influence. It's recognizing that, especially if you're in charge of systems, if you're in charge of building really anything, you're required to include as many people as possible. They call it universal design principles, finding ways to bring the most people to the table. And that can be, quote unquote, expensive, but it doesn't have to be, right? And what we want to avoid is a culture that looks, quite frankly, like people like me, white cisgendered men who really run a lot of the world and don't think much about what folks in all the corners of an organization necessarily care or think about. So I know for myself, this is something I'm struggling with and something I'm trying to incorporate into more of my practice and into my presentations. And I think the real questions we need to be asking ourselves is, what are the challenges to rolling out a psychologically safe agenda that is diverse, inclusive, and decolonizing? It's something I'm working with my teammates to figure out ways to build this in. It could probably be its own presentation. If that's of interest to you, you can email me later and we can have a conversation. But I know some examples. So some examples for guardrails for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that might include really getting creative on some transparent methods, right? In terms of really capturing the thoughts and concerns of people. And I'm not sure what that looks like. If you're in a hybrid situation, that might mean, we used to do Monday check-ins every week. And those have kind of, I haven't been to one in a little while. They were always optional. But it's a place where people could come and, not necessarily talk about work, but to talk about just life and to check in after a weekend. So doing something like that rather than a survey necessarily might be a better approach. Finding people where they're at, right? Especially, and I'm not just talking about hybrid folks, I'm talking about frontline folks too. If you've got newcomers and people who are working the front lines, doing some of the grunt labor that others, through their privilege and their power are able to step back and work from home. What about these folks who are doing other kinds of work? And that would mean also elevating and honoring examples of true compassion. What do you see? Have you noticed people actually, have you noticed others noticing, right? Because sometimes the people who notice aren't going to be the ones saying, oh yeah, look at me, look at me. I actually noticed when someone was struggling and I stepped in and did something about it. They're often the ones who are the least interested in getting, any sort of reward or recognition for that. So it takes people who are really in more of a manager role to say, hey, like this is good. Let's build on that. Let's maybe come up with some ideas on how to be more proactive, right? So that might be a buddy system. That might be doing some other like team-based activities, whatever that might look like. And at the end of the day, whatever you think about when it comes to guardrails, whether that's hybrid or in person, is thinking at that team level, because psychological safety happens at that team level. And it's not as much about, it is about your own mental health and well-being, but it's also really about what the peer group says is a-okay and what isn't. And you'd be amazed at how peer pressure, when used in a positive force, can do good things, right? Because once again, if you're, as I believe, somebody who wants to give, wants to be a contributor for the benefit of whatever the mission or goal might be, then having a team that backs me up on that is gonna be a bonus. So I realized I probably put way too much into this presentation, and Tiffany warned me, should have known better. I even had a case study, but we don't have time for that. So I'm going to end it, and I'm going to go right to my last slide. And I'm going to miss that. Oh, well, I had a great slide on surveillance. I was going to go to town on this. I clearly need to make this a bigger show. So I'm going to just go ahead and open it up. I know I talked a lot about kind of psych health and safety a little more generally, and maybe a little bit less about kind of hybrid tips and tricks. And I think I wasn't really going to focus on tips and tricks because I think it's a bit more fundamental than that. I think it's more about really thinking hard as to why you want to do hybrid. What's the point? And maybe you're a middle manager, maybe you're somebody who doesn't feel like you have any control, any power over that part of it. But you'd be surprised, actually. I think you might actually have a little more informal leadership to set the stage for some really best practices. And this is new. This is all relatively new in terms of streamlining this in terms of work with a capital W. So Tiffany, we've got about 10 minutes left, so I want to just open up to questions. I realize this was just a taste of what is clearly a huge topic. So I will be quiet for a moment.
Geoffrey, thank you so much for great presentation. We got comment here, people saying thank you so much. Your slide was so great. They learned a lot from you. So actually, so far we don't have any questions.
No questions. All right.
Yeah, yet. But you have another kind of 10 minutes, but maybe you could just.
Yeah, I will go to a couple other slides. Right? I'll skip my case study and I'll go to this slide here, and I'll spend the last few minutes. So if you've done any reading on psychological safety, a really great book I'd recommend is called The Fearless Organization by Amy Edmondson. She's a researcher who first worked with healthcare teams to look at what's the secret sauce for some teams versus others. Like why is there this gelling that happens with some and not others? And she's got a whole kind of leadership framework on how to do that. And one of the things I really liked about her approach was what's called setting the stage. And that begins with framing the work. Okay. And so really some of the earliest questions you need to be asking yourself is how do you frame hybrid work? How do you frame part of those expectations, I mean, this sounds really basic, right? But like, what's the point? What's the point of hybrid? Is it really for flexibility for the families and the life of the worker, or is it to simplify the lives of those who are in a more powerful position, whether that be management or the employer? I've done enough work in this area to date that I do think the intentions are good for most employers. They really do want to do right by their employees. And so I think that kernel of truth is there. And I think that it needs to be communicated, because it gets lost in translation. You'd be surprised. It gets lost. And so reminding people what the point of all of this is really important. And so this is just another question for you to ask if you're in the position to look at this, thinking once again, why are we doing this? Is it just to be competitive in terms of providing some benefits, some options to folks who might go to the company next door rather than, so is it about talent shopping, I guess is what I'm getting at, or is it more fundamental than that? Is it looking at some of those psychosocial factors I mentioned at the front end, right? Is it about the balance? Is it about a feasible workload management? So at any rate, what are the so you might be asking, what are signs of hybrid work success? Well, it really is a continuation, hopefully, of other successes. I mean, this is the cold hard truth, and that is you will succeed in hybrid if you have succeeded in person. I know that sounds really kind of pathetic, free advice, but it's so true, right? I think what happens is people look, it's similar to that wellness program I was telling you about. Like, if the idea is just to fix it with a program, fix it with a model, fix it with a framework, you're not going to get to the root causes of why you've got people burning out, why you've got people, I mean, at the end of the day, it might be abject, like not enough resources to do the job, in which case having a hard look at productivity and what you can physically expect your people to do. And I know that's really hard. I mean, I work in healthcare, I work in social services, nonprofit, my partner works for a large educational institution. We're all feeling this inflationary squeeze. I didn't mention that in my pandemic slide, but we're right. I mean, we're all feeling these added stressors. So at any rate, I think policy is a good way to go. And I will probably end mostly on this. Maybe I'll, this was one slide or poll I was going to do, but never got to. So why don't we do this really quick? We'll end on policy, because I am curious for my own interest where you're at with this. Which of the following statements best reflects where your organization is at with hybrid work as a matter of policy? So for the listeners, for the recording, we've talked about it, but we don't have any official hybrid policy in place. So that's choice one. Choice two is we've got a hybrid or remote work policy in place, but we're just not sure if it's working very well. Third choice, right now, we take each request for remote work on a case-by-case basis, depending on whether a bona fide accommodation is warranted. And then my organization won't consider implementing a broader hybrid remote work policy, or none of the above. So I know this is maybe a little more wordy than you were expecting, but the idea here is to just get a sense of where you're at in this thought process. I'll say at the OHC, I mean, we have a remote work policy, but we haven't really thought, okay, what does a hybrid policy look like? So I think we have some work we need to do for ourselves. It's helpful for us to have a schedule of when folks are coming in. So I'm going to end the poll, and you can see the results. Once again, a grab bag. Quite a few say none of this. So that's if we run a workshop, I would be like, hey, what did I miss? Because I want to know where you're at. But most of you are either you've talked about it or you're in the implementation stage. So that's helpful to know. I do not want to run over.
Geoffrey,
yes, do we have a
I
question?
have already copied some question on the Google.
Oh, okay,
Can
good.
you
Let's
please review it? That we really appreciate. Thanks.
Let me pull up because you put it on the. Oh, wow, lots of questions. What's the difference between flexibility and accommodation? Okay, yes, that was another one of my slides I didn't get to. Okay, so we are not talking about accommodation necessarily. That slide I had about self-stigma and psychological safety, that's getting into what is clearly accommodation territory, right? When you've got an issue, whether that's a physical or a mental challenge, whatever that is for your work, that's different. What we're talking about today is hybrid in the sense of the actual work from a more universal design aspect, meaning as much as possible, allowing folks to have some autonomy and control over their work for a number of benefits, and identifying those benefits is really important. And that's where that flexibility piece comes in. It's okay if there's, an unequal flexibility. It's maybe a little more flexible for the worker and a little less flexible for the manager, but the manager recognizes the great benefit that this added flexibility has for the worker or the workforce. So it's a cultural shift. And I want us to move away from the idea of accommodation, because I think that once again gets us back into that kind of more that individualized wellness way of thinking. Not to say that's not important, in return to work, all that stuff is super important, but we're talking about changing the culture and changing the ways of thinking about the work. Because I do believe we are into a future of hybrid work, depending on your sector, depending on exactly your job, right? It's going to be interesting and challenging, but we are headed to a future where it's going to become a bit more of a norm. I think you're going to have younger folks, for example, who are going to be like, I have some choice here. I might try something a little different. Okay, so thank you. And I'm sorry I didn't get to that slide to go into more detail. How to work with employers when they are under the assumption the employee just wants their own way and to work from home. I've had this situation from a manager, and I do advise the work-life balance. I say that to the manager, but sometimes that doesn't matter to them. Okay. So yeah, once again, managers are people too. And I understand that it may not feel that way when you're the worker and they're the one holding the bag when it comes to that authority. So in this case, this has to do with you know what, I'm going to pull up this slide. Sorry, I don't know if I go a couple minutes over, you'll forgive me, but I did want to get this one up there because it does speak to kind of when you turn over rocks, right? Because you're going to turn over rocks in this process. If you're doing it right, this should not be easy. I hate to tell you folks this, but it's not going to be easy. And that's okay. That's okay because you're going to own what's under the rocks, hopefully. If you've got, you know, quite frankly, an upper management team that's going to be supportive of you on this. Okay, so I found some articles that were talking about really the risk of resentment between in-office and remote staff. So if the manager feels like, oh, well, I'm the one stuck in the office, I have to manage all these people who are out and about, and lucky them, they get to work from home, right? And so sometimes you have to like, you know, really confront that, not in a mean way, but just like, hey, like let's be sure we're all on the same page. What are the expectations for remote workers? You know, it's not helpful when someone says, oh, it must be nice to not have to come into the office, or, you know, or maybe it's unrealistic expectations that, you know, I'm not answering my phone every minute of every day just because I'm at home, or just because I'm off site doesn't make me in some way more available. Right. And so, you know, having conversations about like availability, like why you can't reach anyone at a moment's notice. And so some workplaces, this idea of in-person was it really was about control, because, you know, your desk is oriented so that your chair is facing the door and the screen is at the door. And so people can saunter on by and just be like, oh, okay, well, they're working, so that's good, you know? And so if that's the way you're monitoring your workforce, if that's the way you think about that relationship, then no amount of remote work or even policy is going to help that. So it begins with conversations, because there are going to be biases, assumptions, and perceptions that need to be questioned. Okay, remote work, like yesterday, I spent all day on this presentation, all day, Wednesday is my creative day where I'm just like shut down to the world. I'm sitting with my slides, and I have the luxury of that time, and I took it. Nobody bothered me. It was glorious. My partner wasn't even home. And so, like, if what's good for me as far as feedback, what's good for me as far as communication, like, am I being upfront about that? So there's a bit of individual ownership there too, but it happens at the team level, right? So once again, unclear expectations as far as when you're available. Please don't text me. I prefer Slack. Please, it's a little bit of work to try and juggle people, but once again, communication standards, and then finally not noticing those signs of burnout. Right. So if people are resistant, it doesn't necessarily mean they're a bad person. It just might mean they're up to here. Okay. And have you paused long enough to be like, oh, well, I'm feeling up to here too. Is my response, well, they need to, I'm managing. Why aren't they managing? Right. And so if that's your mindset, if that's the way you view certainly your supervisees, or it can also go from the bottom up, by the way. You can also have vertical bullying, worker to employer or worker to manager, right? I prefer to think of this as a kind of a continuum, right? Even though that power structure is there. So my point is, this takes time, and this should be part of any policy development, is really having some what they call World Cafe, or sit down with your folks and have a frank back and forth. But remote workers are actually pretty high risk for burnout. Okay, they really are, because it's hard at home sometimes to set boundaries. Okay, so having those conversations, I think, is also important. Okay, so we are at 10:32, and I realized I have probably bitten off more than I can chew here. If anyone is interested in this as a longer term workshop or a half day, please let me or Tiffany know. Tiffany, my email address, let's put that in the chat. I will do that. And I apologize if what I've done is turned over a big rock and you're feeling like, oh my gosh, what have we done? And there's not a lot of follow up, or there can be follow up. Just let me know. I'm a simple email away. So I will host and panelists. So I'll put this in everyone. G Thompson at ohcmb.ca. Yes, a longer session. And I want to hear from people. This webinar format is really not great because it's very one way, right?
Yeah.
So I think getting some workshopping on this would really be really big. So I'll take this away as a nod in that direction. And Tiffany, I will pass it back to you.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Geoffrey. I really appreciate, your offer to kind of have a longer session with the folks here. Yeah, we already received so many comments saying that, oh yeah, they're interested in really bigger discussion and longer session. We really appreciate it. Yeah, thank you all of you to joining the presentation today. So the session has been recorded. The slide will be shared with you later when this is all available. So hope everyone have a great day. So hope we'll see you next month though. Thank you, Geoffrey, again. Thank you all of you. Bye.